Donald Trump is just simply a transformative president. A little over a week ago, major hostilities break out in the Middle East. And as the Admiral just talked about, this is the lifeblood of global oil flows. Big flows for natural gas as well. Everyone's predicting for sure over $100 oil is just around the corner. Then we have strong leadership from our president, precision strikes over the weekend to take out Iran's key nuclear facilities. Everyone thinks that's another $20 on the price of oil. And here we are Monday evening, and oil dropped below $70 a barrel. And more importantly for American consumers, wholesale gasoline was down over 10 cents today and diesel down 15%. That is the collective benefits of President Trump's energy dominance agenda and his strong, clear, peace through strength leadership style. It's just transforming the Middle East.
Now, Mr. Secretary, for those of us who were young politicos back in the 80s, and I happen to work for President Reagan, this is a Reagan-esque move on the part of President Trump. I mean, the America First agenda at play. There were a lot of people on the right who were very concerned, and I had my, concerns. I don't like any military involvement if we can avoid it. But he made a decision that there was no good reason to avoid this military engagement, that it was critical for America first.
I love the Reagan-esque comparison. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the Soviet Union completely differently than all the leaders. Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all
Soviet
live busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles, and
differently
we don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all
Soviet
live busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles, and we
differently
don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all
Soviet
live busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles, and we
differently
don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all live
Soviet
busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles, and we
differently
don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all live
Soviet
busy
Union
and active lifestyles, and we
completely
don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all live
Soviet
busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles, and we
differently
don't
than all
want
the
muscular
leaders.
and body pain interrupting our day. Try Transact. South Africa's
Ronald Reagan just looked at the
We all live
Soviet
busy
Union
and active
completely
lifestyles.
Heck of a night, really, for all involved. And, let's begin from way back, almost 12 hours back. Iran said that it was retaliating against the U.S. strikes. It targeted U.S. bases in the region, and then it started firing salvos of missiles against Israel. Then we heard from the American president, Donald Trump, saying that with his participation with the U.S. strikes and the U.S. influence, he was able to secure a ceasefire, and that both sides will stop firing at about 400 GMT. Then we saw 5 successive salvos of Iranian missiles, lethal, really, especially in a direct impact incident in Beersheba in southern Israel. At least 4 killed. All the while, we didn't hear anything. Israelis were waking up to the news for quiet that Iran had hit Israel, and they were hearing already from opposition leaders taking jabs at Netanyahu, who, as far as the Israeli right wing is concerned, has achieved something historic. We got a statement from the office of the Israeli Prime Minister saying that Israel accepts this ceasefire. And there's a very interesting line that speaks to where the mindset of Benjamin Netanyahu is, which says the state of Israel achieved great historical achievements and placed itself on a par with the world powers. This is a tremendous success for the people of Israel and to his warriors who removed the 2 existential threats to our state and ensured the eternity of Israel. So this is where the narrative needs to be as far as Benjamin Netanyahu is concerned. This was a historic achievement for Israel. Israel got what it wanted, and now it can move on. Of course, there are still many other fronts of many other wars that Israel continues to wage, namely, and in particular, Gaza, where all attention will be shifted to now because there are still Israeli captives in Gaza, and there is no end in sight to that genocidal war.
Noor, interesting, towards the end of the statement, President Netanyahu says Israel thanks President Trump and the United States for their support in defense and their participation in eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat. A couple of things there. Firstly, this is going to be seen as a huge win, is it not, for Donald Trump? And also this point on eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat. We don't actually know that for a fact, do we?
No, we don't. We don't. And I think that ambiguity allows everybody to take a step back. Donald Trump can claim victory. He can play the peacemaker. He can say that I didn't go to war. The U.S. strikes actually facilitated an end to the war. Israel, which started this confrontation that put the entire region on edge, can claim that it achieved something historic, something that no other Israeli prime minister had been able to achieve. And Iran, at the same time, can also say that Iran was able to withstand all of that firepower and the U.S. strikes, that it did not crumble, that it did not raise a white flag. We don't know if there's an actual agreement, a text, if you will. We don't know if there were details, if the two parties agreed to certain things. What we do know is that the equation of calm for calm is now in place, and that leaves a lot of things open, but it does allow everybody to take a step back, to recover from this battering 12 days. Both sides took a beating. Israel is not without losses. It's not without a lot to recover from, economically speaking. And the same applies for Iran. So for now, it seems that at least this announcement can be played to everyone's domestic purposes as a win.
Yeah, just on that last point, Noor, do we have a sense at all of how ordinary Israelis are going to feel about this decision? I know in the days up to this point, many Israeli analysts were saying to us, you know, the Israeli people are very much on side with Prime Minister Netanyahu when it comes to the threat from Iran. But there has been a lot of damage in Israel. Just in the last few hours, another 4 Israelis have been killed in southern Israel. Do we have a sense at all of how ordinary Israelis are going to react to this news of the ceasefire?
I think it's safe to assume that ordinary Israelis will be relieved that they don't have to stay close to shelters, that the state of emergency won't persist, that the airspace in Israel is now open, and that planes of tens of thousands of Israelis stranded outside the country can now land in Ben Gurion, Tel Aviv. Remember that just yesterday we heard from the Israeli tax authorities saying that in 12 days it had received individual requests for compensation amounting to over 1.2 or 1.3 billion US dollars. And I think a lot of former Israeli army officials who were warning about a war of attrition would be taking a sigh of relief now, knowing that it's over, that Israel wouldn't have to play this out much longer, longer than it did, and that it can, like I said, take a victory lap, if you will, domestically and move on, even though there are questions that remain to be answered, and that's why Iran can also claim a victory for its own purposes and to its own public.
Okay, many thanks for that, Noor Odeh. That was in Amman. Let's get reaction from Tehran. Tauhid Asadi is in Iran's capital, Tauhid. So we now have this official confirmation from the Israeli government, from Prime Minister.
We, the wanted. Azaro forever wanted, the new election.
On Iranian leadership.
Your understanding is Iranian side about the rich. This is what we have so far. In addition, we've got the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi coming out on his X account to say that there was no confirmation about the possibility of actually a deal being reached in that regard. Also, he said that Israel started this war, meaning that, in a sense, it could be Iran to finish it. This is a statement that we previously heard from other Iranian officials saying that it was the Israelis who began these strikes, but we are going to finish it. And now the reality on the ground is that Iranians were there to have the last strike, and then we've got this announcement by the Israeli side about the ceasefire agreements between the two sides. Yet again, we have to remind the audience that Iran has yet to confirm such a deal to be reached, but still we know that Iran is saying that it's going to strike back in case Israelis decide to have any new strikes against the country. And I can say that right now, the name of the game is changing from escalation to de-escalation, but still the situation looks quite fragile as Israelis have got this record of breaching ceasefire agreements, and Iran is pretty much aware of that there is a possibility for further reinitiation of this confrontation, which went to an unprecedented level. And nobody could have expected such a confrontation taking place over the past 12 days that we saw. We saw different places here in the capital being targeted, nuclear facilities were targeted, different military complexes sites were targeted, top high-ranking military officials, including the head of IRGC, the commander-in-chief IRGC, Hossein Salami, were killed among many nuclear scientists of the country. So here we see a considerable amount of repercussions for Iranians, and we can rest assured that even though this ceasefire might be there being effective, hostility remains, seeing the background, seeing the history that exists when it comes to the obnoxious behavior of the Israelis targeting different places, nuclear facilities, military facilities. But there is another dimension that we could add to this already complicated scenario, and that is the public sentiment here in Tehran and across the country. There is this increasing sense of anger, and we have to keep in mind, on Friday, there was a nationwide protest demonstration calling for Iran, the political establishment, to strike back. And also the same was repeated when the American strike happened, targeting Iranian 3 important nuclear facilities. And that means there is sort of anger. And this is the key point of concern that we have to keep in mind. For the time being, we can be hopeful that we can see a potential ceasefire, paving the way for a, let's say, de-escalation in longer run. But whether or not that's going to be stable is something that we have to keep waiting to see. Obviously, Iranians are going to interpret as a victory for themselves, because first of all, it was the Israelis that announced this ceasefire being accepted. They announced it after the very last attacks, the very last strikes by the Iranians targeting actually key important sites across the Israeli territories, and also it's going to be interpreted as a victory for Iran, seeing that they retaliated as much as they could.
Yeah, on that point, Iranians clearly keen to show to their domestic audience that this is a victory for the Iranian leadership. But when you look at some of the wording of the statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he thanks President Trump and the United States for its support in their defense and how their participation has eliminated the Iranian nuclear threat and removed Iran's dual immediate existential threat from nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. What sort of message is that sending to the Iranian leadership, and how do you expect them to react to statements like that?
Well, the message is the same hostility that has been expected from the Israeli-American side. We know that this is not for today, yesterday, or the day before. There is this long history of hostility between the two sides. It goes without saying. But it's still, speaking of the potential responses, we have heard it already from Iranian officials that, for instance, when it comes to the nuclear program of the country, this is based on an indigenous knowledge, and Iran is not going to stop there. Also, when it comes to the damage, we have yet to receive a comprehensive, precise report on the amount of damage, specifically when it comes to 3 nuclear important facilities in Natanz, in Isfahan, and in Fordo. They are saying that they are also still assessing the amount of damage there. But what goes without saying is that Iranian officials are saying they're going to continue their nuclear program still in a peaceful manner, as they said before, but still there are damages caused by these actually attacks. We know that some infrastructures, not necessarily related to nuclear or military sites, but a number of fuel depots were targeted by the Israelis, and that's going to take some time to rebuild those damaged places, those damaged infrastructures. That's going to be considered, obviously, a blow, but it's still the possibility of de-escalation is something that is going to be priceless for both sides, I guess.
What does all this mean for the future of the Iranian leadership, do you think, Tauhid, if this is really the end of the hostilities? How will ordinary Iranians react? They have, of course, been rallying around the flag as the country was being struck. Do you think that is going to continue, or will they, now that the hostilities have stopped, demand change from those at the top?
I would say the confrontation might be partially over, but hostility does not stop at this point, as we see this rhetoric of different statements coming from both sides. Speaking of the impact or the influence of this, we can say that, yes, obviously we see a certain considerable increasing amount of solidarity among Iranians after these strikes. And it's going to be out there for at least for a midterm. We can expect a continuation of that. And the threat is out there, and this is not something new. Maybe it's not getting translated into day by day, hour by hour strikes, but the threat is still there. Also, these recent confrontations could be, in a sense, helpful for Iranian officials to be further aware of their disadvantages, specifically when it comes to their actually air defense system, which was partially criticized for some of the incidents, for some of the strikes that happened, and it was sort of interpreted as a infiltration or penetration into this system. So there are going to more work to be done. But the thing is that something very interesting about these attacks was the way the structure managed it to actually repair itself. We know that a considerable number of top military officials were killed, but again, after just a very short amount of time, the country managed to rebuild the structure, to reappoint new people, and then it came to strike back the Israelis. And of course, there's going to be a certain level of preparedness for any potential scenario down the road, specifically seeing the very fact that they saw the direct U.S. intervention, and this was just a limited extent. To tell you the truth, just 3 points were targeted by the American strikes. That could have been much more than that. And now Iranians are getting prepared to actually improve, both on their defense capabilities while working on their missile capabilities and other military capabilities as well.
Okay, many thanks for that, Tawhid Asadi there for us in Tehran. Let's go back to Noor Odeh. She joins us from Jordan's capital in Amman. And Noor, we're starting to get even more reaction from Israeli leadership after that statement released from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Just talk us through all the various responses.
Let me say that despite reports that Benjamin Netanyahu had instructed his ministers not to comment, we've already heard from at least one minister, the Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, and he said that now that Israel has achieved this victory, then it is time to move and finish the job in Gaza. Israel will move full force ahead to finish what had been started and to achieve security and prosperity for Israel for many years to come. We're also hearing from the leaders of the opposition. Yair Lapid, who leads the opposition bloc in the Israeli Knesset, also talked about Gaza, congratulating Israel on this achievement, but really shifting attention to where it will inevitably go in the next hours in Israel, to Gaza. There are 50 Israeli captives still there. That war being very polarizing and not as popular as the strikes on Iran. Yair Lapid calling for an end to the war on Gaza, as did Yair Golan, another prominent figure in the Israeli opposition who heads the former Labor Party, if you will. He also said that it is important now to shift attention back to Gaza. And I would suspect that much of the commentary will be focused on that. We've already heard from the families of Israeli captives who had warned that an end to the confrontation with Iran without a conclusive end to the issue of the captives, to returning them home, would mean that this was all for nothing. This was, of course, an emotional plea at the last hour, but the decision had been made and the deal had been brokered. Ceasefire, as far as Israel is concerned, was accepted as it was proposed by Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you for that update, Noor Odeh, there for us in Amman. Okay, let's take a closer look at that statement by the Israeli government when they agreed to the ceasefire announced by President Trump. In a statement, it says Israel thanks President Trump and the United States for their support in defense and their participation in eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat. In light of achieving the objectives of the operation and in full coordination with President Trump, Israel has agreed to the president's proposal. Israel will respond forcibly to any violation of the ceasefire. Israeli citizens must continue to strictly adhere to the Home Front Command's instructions until full compliance with the ceasefire is confirmed. Okay, let's get more with Ori Goldberg, is an Israeli political commentator. He joins us from Tel Aviv. Ori, so a very, very eventful sort of 12 hours or so. Let's begin with that statement from the Israeli government. What do you make of it, the fact that they have agreed to the ceasefire?
I think it's somewhat ridiculous, especially the stressing of the goals of the operation. It is really unclear, and that is to say the least, what Israel's goals were. I mean, over the past week, we've heard Israel talk about everything from the decapitation of the nuclear program to regime change. Yesterday, the day before, were spent bombing what Israel called symbols of the regime in Tehran, said absolutely nothing about the nuclear program. It's still completely unclear whether Iran's stockpile of fissionable material was hurt during the American attacks on Fordo and the other facilities. True, there's been damage to facilities, but it's not clear what has been done. And let's go back a little bit and remember that nothing had essentially changed in the situation between Iran and Israel. There was never an imminent, inevitable threat. This was a decision that through and through was made on the basis of political considerations, mostly domestic, some of them foreign, but all of them having to do with Gaza and not with an imminent threat from Tehran. So the statement trying to spin Israel's position at the moment after
to this ceasefire?
There are two reasons, and I would assume that both apply. The first is that they were finally told to agree. They were told by the Trump administration, and having decided to hitch the Israeli horse to the Trump wagon, Netanyahu had no choice. He decided to gamble on Trump coming to his rescue. Trump did, and Netanyahu was therefore obligated to assist in Trump's goal, which was, as it still is, ultimately securing a regional deal and not launching a regional war. And the second reason was that the damages were beginning to accrue in Israel. Israel is not doing well. Our famed air defense system managed to intercept a large number of the missiles launched by Iran on the Israeli home front, on the Israeli heartland. But a large number actually came through, and not only did they come through, they did very, very direct lethal damage. And Israel was running out of aerial interceptors, even if the United States would have agreed to fund them, or additional ones, which is not sure at all at the moment. But even if there was such an agreement, it would have taken time. I don't think Israel could have really borne the brunt of a long missile-based war of attrition with Iran. Israel could have continued to strike in Tehran. There are, as we know from Israel's experience in Gaza, endless targets should Israel choose to strike them, especially if Israel develops them, as the algorithmic language goes. But other than striking and killing and destroying, which Israel does with abandon in Iran as it does in Gaza, there are no strategic goals to be attained. And I believe that even Netanyahu came to the realization that that was true and decided to end when he was made an offer he couldn't refuse by the Trump administration.
Regardless of motivations or political motivations on any of the sides, do you think this ceasefire is going to hold?
I would presume that it will. I'm cautiously optimistic. Again, there's absolutely no reason for anybody to expand what happened over the last 11 days to a regional war. The region doesn't want a war. And that includes both Iran and the Sunni Gulf monarchies and just about every other country. Even Israel, despite its desire for disruption and disorder, doesn't want a regional war, especially when it remains completely unclear whether Israel has managed to do serious damage to the Iranian nuclear program. And I believe that if all sides want some kind of regulated agreement, then it will ultimately be some kind of regulated agreement. I don't think we will see any kind of tit for tat as we saw over the past 11 days, unless there is a unilateral act without provocation, similar to the Israeli strike which began this war.
Yeah, interesting that point about provocation. I just want to ask, I mean, before this ceasefire was announced, the Iranian parliament said it was seeking to suspend cooperation with the nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. If they say they're going to continue to pursue this, what does Israel do next?
Israel is not a signatory to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's not in a position to do much of anything. But the Iranian parliament is, even if we consider it a democratically elected institution, which it is to some extent not, the Iranian parliament is hardline. That is the position that controls the Iranian parliament at the moment. The Iranian parliament does not make foreign policy decisions. That is up to the supreme leader and the president and the foreign minister, all of whom, by the way, function very efficiently as a team over this week and a half. I think it's a good point in which to reiterate what your Tehran correspondent said. The Islamic Republic comes out of this still standing, and that is in many ways a victory for the Islamic Republic. Okay. Its existence was never really in doubt.
Ori, thank you so much for your time. Ori Goldberg, Israeli political commentator, joining us there from Tel Aviv.
Thank you.
Okay, I just want to recap our top story this hour. Israel's government has now officially agreed to a ceasefire announced by the US President Donald Trump. It comes, of course, after nearly 2 weeks of military conflict between Iran and Israel. In that statement, Israel said it has removed Tehran's dual immediate existential threat from its nuclear weapons and its ballistic missiles. Well, just hours before US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire, strikes by Iran on Israel killed at least 4 people in the last hour or so. A missile hit a building in Beersheba in southern Israel. Meanwhile, earlier, Iran launched a missile strike on America's largest military base in the Middle East, here in Qatar. Interceptions were seen over the capital, Doha. Qatar's Interior Ministry says some debris fell in residential areas. No casualties were reported. Okay, you are up to date. I am Marlene Saeed. Don't forget, you can check out our website, aljazeera.com. There you can see all the latest developments on the Iran-Israel war and the announcement of a ceasefire this morning. Stay with us here on Al Jazeera. Coming up next is Radicalized Youth.
On Counting the Cost, how will the Israel-Iran conflict affect oil and gas prices and energy supplies? Will geopolitical tensions reignite inflation, disrupt trade routes, and derail the economy? And can the two nations afford an all-out war? Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera.
Hidden in the forest is a vanishing treasure. This is where chocolate begins. Once abundant, now harder to find. Too much rain, too much heat, and now a killer lurking in the shadows, the black pod disease, a plague slashing yields by half.
Okay, I've been waiting for this moment. Fragrance is out of this world.
For the Kouassi brothers, it's about protecting a plant overused and undervalued, turning what was once just bittersweet into sovereign African cocoa.
The story of a small community in one of Mexico's most dangerous states, standing up to criminal cartels and corrupt politicians.
We don't want politicians anymore. They just disunite the people.
In the last episode of Democracy Maybe, we explore how Tehran's elders led the fight for self-determination.
At that time, thinking of the Narcos was the same as thinking of Tehran's government.
By the people on Al Jazeera. Global criminal drug dealing shifted to places beyond the reach of law and order.
There are many people in the Afghan government who are involved in the drug trade.
Guerrilla wars in Colombia. And Mexico, where the cartels have been responsible for a merciless spiral of violence. The final episode of Drug Trafficking, Politics and Power, The Lost Territories on Al Jazeera.
To the now president of the whole company, and nobody would have expected such a confrontation taking place over the past 12 days that we saw different places here in the capital being targeted, nuclear facilities were targeted, different military complexes.
I'm fully backable with Al Jazeera's special coverage of the latest developments in the conflict between Israel and Iran. Coming up, Israel's Prime Minister agrees to a ceasefire with Iran hours after Donald Trump announced it had come into effect. The U.S. President urges Iran and Israel.
My work is easy because I use ClickUp. Here's how I keep track of all my tasks. I start by brain dumping everything I need to get done in a list view. Next, I set a priority and a due date to keep things on track. I create custom statuses to organize my progress exactly how I want it. I like to add the action items field so AI can show me the next steps. I add my teammates as watchers so they're in the loop. ClickUp makes work easy, from personal projects to running a multi-billion-dollar company. Click the link below to create your workspace for free.
New Benylin 4 Cough with a multi-action formula suitable from age 2.
It comes after nearly 2 weeks of direct military conflict with Tehran. Israel says it has removed what it calls a dual immediate existential threat from nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. The statement from the Prime Minister reads, Israel thanks President Trump and the United States for their support in defense and their participation in eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat. In light of achieving the objectives of the operation and in full coordination with President Trump, Israel has agreed to the president's proposal. Israel will respond forcefully to any violation of the ceasefire, the statement goes on to say. Israeli citizens must continue to strictly adhere to the Home Front Command's instructions until full compliance with the ceasefire is confirmed. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump has warned both sides against violating the truce. Hours before Trump announced it had come into effect, strikes by Iran on Israel killed at least 4 people. This is the moment a missile hit a building in Beersheba in southern Israel. Under the terms of Trump's ceasefire, Israel can still attack Iran in the coming hours, but Tehran cannot retaliate. Well, we're unpacking all these latest developments with our correspondents in Washington, D.C., Tehran and Amman. And Amman is where we begin. The Jordanian capital, Noor O'Day, is there for us, monitoring the situation in Israel. Noor, what an eventful 24 hours. Tell us about what's been happening in the last hour and the announcement by the Israeli Prime Minister that they've accepted the ceasefire that was announced by the Trump administration.
Well, Foley, after that 1 or 2 hours of radio silence of Iranian missiles launched at Israel, of 3 buildings now in danger of collapse and several casualties reported, we saw a statement from the Israeli Prime Minister, in a way responding to opposition leaders who were already hitting the airwaves, and in another preempting or trying to frame the discussion moving forward. As you said, the announcement, the statement declared Israel's acceptance of Donald Trump's ceasefire proposal. It also, in a way, declared victory. The statement talked about a historic achievement, about unprecedented success, and about Israel being on par with other world powers. Now, this is very important for Benjamin Netanyahu personally. He will be speaking later on in the day, addressing the public. But for him, this is also about his legacy. He needs to present this ceasefire agreement as a historic victory. And in many ways, this is at least a historic achievement in the Israeli context. Israel being able to strike Iran, to take all those hits and still maintain the solid support and participation of the United States, and a really negligible pushback from the rest of the Western Hemisphere.
As you say, Noor, he's declaring this as a victory. How is this going down in Israel, and how will this go down with the hardline members of his government who wanted to go to war with Iran? Will they also see this as a victory?
Well, the hardliners in this government have been instructed not to comment, but we've already heard from the Israeli Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, who's a key ally and a key minister in this coalition. He said that this achievement was very important and historic for Israel, and that now the country will move with full force ahead, back and focus all its force and effort on Gaza. This is, of course, a preemptive strike, if you will, from Bezalel Smotrich, who has already heard opposition leaders talking about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. Smotrich not letting that go and talking about more war. But I think it's important to keep in mind that it would have been very difficult, if not outright impossible, for anyone in the Israeli government, including those hardliners, to oppose Donald Trump's proposition for a ceasefire. Israel depends on the U.S. not just for political support, not just for those strikes on the 3 nuclear facilities in Iran, but also for the supply of weapons. Israel was low on its supply of the air defense missiles. It needed American support. It received 14 cargo planes, military planes, of ammunition and weapons during this 12-day confrontation.
Right.
So no to Trump would have probably not been considered.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister did thank President Trump in his statement for his participation, for the U.S.'s participation in the conflict. I imagine, Noor, that this will be a great sigh of relief for Israelis. The past 12 days have been costly to them.
Very costly indeed, and we're still waiting for the final tally on casualties. But at least 4 killed today. There were 24 or 25 people confirmed killed in the days past. Unprecedented losses in terms of buildings that have collapsed, of buildings that remain condemned for demolition because of the damages sustained fully. Entire neighborhoods impacted, devastated, really. And the Israeli tax authority has been trying to also inform the public, to draw a few parallels. Let me give you an example. In the past 12 days, the Israeli authorities received nearly 40,000 individual requests for compensation, amounting to over $1.3 billion US dollars. That's just the compensation request of individual Israelis for losses incurred to their private property. Now, in the past 20 months of Israel's multi-frontal war, the tax authorities received a compensation request for less than that amount. So that begins to give you a picture of just how different, how unprecedented this confrontation was. And the Israeli public and many commentators were beginning to ask questions. How long can this last, and what is the end game? Now that a ceasefire has been accepted by Israel, then, they can talk about how much was achieved and how much can Israel claim victory, but at least people will not be in the shelters, and it won't be a state of emergency. And the airspace in Israel is now open to receive thousands of Israelis who have been stranded outside of the country during those days.
Noor, thank you very much for that. That's Al Jazeera's Noor O'Day in Amman. We'll, of course, be coming back to you throughout the morning here for the latest reaction and analysis of Israel accepting the ceasefire with Iran, which was announced by President Trump. Let's now head to Tehran, the Iranian capital. Tauhid Asadi is there for us. Tauhid, official confirmation from the Israelis that they've accepted the ceasefire. Any official confirmation from the Iranians?
Not yet, we haven't received any confirmation from Iranian officials on the acceptance of a deal related to ceasefire. But still, I can say that the name of the game is changing now from escalation to de-escalation, as we see signs of hope about more potentiality for a ceasefire between the two sides who just experienced an unprecedented level of confrontation and escalation over the past 12 days. And now we see there is a possibility for settling down and for stepping back from these strikes. The latest statements actually came from the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi hours after announcement by the U.S. President Donald Trump about the ceasefire. He came out to say that there is no agreement of ceasefire or there is no deal reached in this regard. But he said that there is going to be a cessation for military operations. And of course, this is going to be a key fundamental factor for that. And there is a big if for that. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that it's going to be only possible if Israelis decide to stop their aggressions. And the reality on the ground right now as we speak is that we don't see the continuation of Israeli strikes as we saw last night.
Okay.
Sounds of massive explosion heard in the capital, but right now things look more promising.
Right. If, as you say, Tauhid, the name of the game right now is de-escalation, how will the Iranian leaders be presenting this to the Iranian public as a victory, and what will that mean going forward?
Indeed, yes, it sounds like a victory, specifically for several reasons. First of all, it was the Israeli side that first came out to accept this ceasefire. And also, they were saying that Israelis were not capable enough, and that's why they knocked the door of Americans to come and get intervened in this already intricate situation. And also, this is a statement that we heard from Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who said that Israelis started the war, and now it could be in a sense implied that this was the Israeli side who began the war, but it was the Iranian side who decided on the point at which it should be finished. That's something that Iranians and Iranian officials in particular could interpret as a sort of victory for themselves, specifically seeing the fact that for the latest hours prior to announcement of this ceasefire, we saw several rounds of Iranian missiles landing in the Israeli territories, and now they can say that we were there to have the final shot.
And we also saw, of course, that Iranian attack on the U.S. base in Qatar. And if Iranians, as you say, will be presenting this as a victory, it'll be interesting to see if this opens the way forward for some sort of diplomacy with Israel, diplomatic negotiations with Israel and the U.S., especially the U.S., I guess. As I asked Noor, Tawhid, about the cost of the war in Israel, I'd also like to know, I guess, what these 12 days have meant for Iran and its people, the cost of this conflict.
Considerable cost, I would say, as we see a lot of damages out there, specifically when it comes to the nuclear facilities. We know that in the American strikes, we saw at least 3 important nuclear facilities of the country in Natanz, in Isfahan, in Fordo, being targeted by the Americans. And that's not it. We saw Natanz being targeted by the Israelis as well. And beyond actually the nuclear facilities, it was different military sites being targeted by the Israelis. And added to that is the very fact that several high-ranking, I would say highest-ranking military officials were assassinated, including the top commander, the commander-in-chief of IRGC, Hossein Salami. And also, when it comes to nuclear scientists, we've got the same thing. We've got several nuclear scientists being killed as a result of these strikes, including Faridoon Abbasi, the former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, as well as Tehranchi, Dr. Tehranchi, who was the president of Azad University. And also, we have to keep in mind that it was not just limited to military places and nuclear facilities, as we saw a considerable amount of civilian casualties, as many civilian infrastructures, including residential buildings, were targeted in the Israeli strikes, and also infrastructures related to energy. We know that at least 2 free fuel depots in the capital were targeted. So there is this damaged public sentiment. And you see, if you look at that, an increasing amount of anger, as we saw different protests here and there in different parts of the country, going out to chant against Israelis and Americans. At least a part of the society were out there to express this sense of anger. And we know that also part of the population living in Tehran, a city that hosts over 10 million people, decided to go out of the town due to these threats. And now they're getting back.
Tawhid, thank you very much. Tawhid Assadi in Tehran. We will, of course, also come back to you with the latest reaction from there. Now let's head to Washington, D.C., where Phil Lavelle is. And Washington is, of course, where President Trump announced a few hours ago that he had reached a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. And the president making a number of posts on social media in the last few hours. Phil, bring us up to speed with what he's been saying.
No room at all for ambiguity. A message sent out at 1 o'clock in the morning on Truth Social, that is his social network platform, reading, "The ceasefire is now in effect. Please do not violate it." Signed, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Short there and to the point, but actually that was his second message in the last few hours, because a little earlier he put out another message in which he praised those involved in Operation Midnight Hammer back on Saturday, in which he talked about the pilots, those involved. He said that they had a perfect hit. That's how he described it, and said in a kind of way, in a kind of ironic way, it had brought everybody together. Now, there are varying accounts of how this ceasefire came about. Donald Trump had said that both Israel and Iran had called him pretty much at the same time saying, "We want peace." whereas the Iranians have said on television, this was one of their news anchors, said that Trump called in what she described a begging-like manner following that attack on that US air base in Qatar. But here's what we do know, at least according to the White House and Donald Trump, of how it all unfolded. Donald Trump managed to broker an agreement with the Israelis. He spoke to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Once that was done, he called the Emir of Qatar and said, look, can you bring the Iranians on side? I've got the Israelis here. That's all sorted. I need the Iranians to be brought on side. They got to work, the Emir and the Qatari Prime Minister. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance, who is the Vice President here, plus the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, they were also having indirect and direct talks with the Iranians. And then when it all started to come together, J.D. Vance and the Qatari Prime Minister managed to sort out the finer details. And that is how we believe the ceasefire came about. So it is now officially in place. Question is it going to last?
Indeed, is it going to last? Is it going to hold? But this will no doubt be seen, Phil, as a victory for Donald Trump, for the US president, because he brokered this. What has been the reaction to this in Washington, especially from those who opposed President Trump directly entering the conflict on behalf of Israel?
Well, you bear in mind that he'd sold himself throughout the election campaign as being the peacemaker-in-chief, somebody that could bring about stability. And there had been a lot of criticism, not just from the Democrats, which you would expect, but also those within the Republican Party. I've got to say, he's getting some praise, not just from the Republicans, but there have been a few Democrats who've said this could be a good thing, obviously with the caveat that they are not happy, that they believe he overstepped his constitutional authority. In fact, some are calling for his impeachment. But on the Republican side, he's also getting a lot of praise. You know, you've got Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House. He always seems to fall in line with Donald Trump, so it's not a huge surprise that he said that this was great. He described it as an example of peace through strength, which is one of the phrases Donald Trump had talked about a lot during the election campaign. But then you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman from Georgia. She's usually a very fierce backer of Donald Trump. But the last few days, she had been very against this. Now, she's part of the Make America Great Again movement, and they are all about America first, not getting involved in any foreign wars, you know, letting those other countries sort out their problems. However, she's come back into the fold as well because she's congratulated Donald Trump. She said, thank you for pursuing peace. Meanwhile, there are lots of questions being asked here about whether or not Operation Midnight Hammer did exactly what it was meant to do. Because obviously the administration is saying that it led to complete and utter obliteration of Iran's nuclear hopes. But there are some experts, some analysts who are saying, you know, it's far too early to say if that uranium was destroyed, especially amidst those reports that some of it could have been moved. J.D. Vance was asked about this on Fox News last night. The actual question was, has that uranium been destroyed? He didn't answer it. He said, actually, I think the question is this, and then he went off on a different tangent. But that's one of the big questions. Regardless of whether or not there's a ceasefire over the coming weeks or coming days, the intelligence community, the journalists, pretty much everybody in Washington is going to be asking, where did that uranium go?
Phil Lavelle in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for that for now. Now, before the ceasefire announcement, Iran fired a salvo of missiles at a U.S. military base in Qatar on Monday, as you heard from our correspondents. It was an unprecedented attack on a neighboring country, which Iran has long held close relations with. But Tehran says the attack was a justified response to the American strikes on its nuclear facilities on Sunday. In the last few minutes, we've heard that foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, will be meeting here in Doha for an exceptional meeting to discuss Iran's attack on the U.S. base here in Qatar. Here's Behdad Maheshi with more.
Projectiles and interceptions in the sky, this time over the Qatari capital, Doha. Shelter-in-place warnings as a barrage of Iranian missiles target the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East, in what's being seen as a symbolic show of force. Tehran calls it legitimate self-defense and retaliation for the American bombing of its nuclear facilities on Sunday.
The message of this decisive action is clear and direct to the White House and its allies. The Islamic Republic of Iran will not leave any act of aggression against its territorial integrity, sovereignty, or national security unanswered under any circumstances.
All right, I'm going to have to be very careful. Whoa!
The airspace temporarily closed over Qatar as defenses shot down all but one of the missiles fired, the attack resulting in no injuries or deaths. But drawing condemnation from Qatar, which holds deep ties with Iran.
Qatar condemns, in the most severe words, the Iranian missile attack on the Al Udeid Qatari airbase. This attack represents a blatant violation of the sovereignty of the country of Qatar and a contradiction to the principles of good neighborliness, and represents an attack on international legitimacy and international law. And the state of Qatar confirms that it reserves the right to respond.
The sprawling Al Udeid base just outside of the capital Doha typically hosts some 10,000 American troops. But most personnel and aircraft were evacuated last week, the clearance visible in satellite imagery. Washington and Qatar say they were warned in advance that the attack was coming. Some suggesting it's Tehran's way of signaling it doesn't want to escalate the conflict further. Behdad Mehichi, Al Jazeera.
Again, in the last few minutes, foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council have released a statement saying that they will meet in Doha for an exceptional meeting this Tuesday after Iran's attack on the U.S. base here in Qatar. To discuss all these latest developments, I'm now joined by Luciano Saccaran, Associate Professor of Gulf Politics at Qatar University. We'll get to the attack on the Al Udeid base and its implications for the region in just a moment, Luciano, but I just wanted to get your thoughts first on the developments of the last few hours in Israel agreeing to the ceasefire that was announced by the U.S. President Donald Trump. How momentous is this for the region?
Well, I mean, honestly speaking, you wake up in the morning and you don't know what is going to happen along the whole day. I went to bed with already the ceasefire announced by Trump, even though it was not accepted by Iran and by Israel. Now it seems that Israel accepted. Arakchik was saying that there was no agreement, and they launched the last salvo of missile. So it looks like everything was more or less prepared in advance, that everybody was trying to save face and to claim that the objectives were all achieved in the three sides, in the U.S., Israeli and Iranian side, in order to avoid the escalation, that the escalation was prevented a long time ago, but before everybody needed to claim that these goals were achieved in order to appease their own public opinion.
All sides here can claim victory, essentially.
Well, if you read the press these days, in all the cases, they are claiming that they achieved their goals. I mean, Iran press made very clear that they achieved what they wanted, which is sending a very strong signal to the U.S. that they will attack American interests or Israeli interests if they are attacked. What they did it even today against Israel as well. Israel claimed that they eliminated the missile threat.
Even though we don't know if that's really the case, because there's no assessment of the damage.
We know because they were shooting missiles until now, so there are missile launchers still there. And the United States claimed that they did what they wanted, supposedly eliminating all the nuclear facilities in Iran. And since there was no casualty or no harm in the U.S. base, we don't see any problem with that.
But does this, Luciano, mark a shift from deterrence to de-escalation, or is it just a tactical pause? Because the differences remain.
There's something about mom's touch. It makes cough, headache, and blocked nose go poof.
It's more than just my touch. It's Vicks VapoRub. It relieves nasal congestion, cough, body ache, headache, and muscle stiffness for a good night's sleep. Vicks VapoRub.
The axis of resistance was damaged, and Iran could not impose more. Impose more rules of this game, so they accepted to sit down with the United States to start negotiating something. Here there is a clear evidence that even though there were some signals that there were some track 2 agreements signed already and accepted by Pezeshkian about the use of some nuclear technology for medical uses, Trump did not care about that because Netanyahu was pressing him in order to achieve his own goals. So the one who settled the agenda, what should be achieved, was Netanyahu. We saw also that there were discrepancies about regime change. Trump was not interested in that. Netanyahu was saying, no, we need to destroy the military capability, nuclear capability, and also the ideological capability that is targeting Israel. Trump is okay. If this happens, I will not say no, but I don't care about what the Iranians do inside Iran. Now we come back to 12 days back,
right,
in which more or less everybody is satisfied, and we have to see now in the future if Israel keeps
because the
seeing
confrontation may be over for now, but the hostilities that have existed for decades remain, right? And the question is whether the ceasefire will hold, how long it will hold, and what needs to happen for it to hold.
Well, I mean, there's something that this is the elephant in the room. Gaza is still there.
Yes.
I mean, people is being killed in more quantity than ever before. 100 people are being killed every day.
Hello?
And this seems to be not important anymore, at least for Israel or for the United States. Now everybody's working that. I assume that now Trump is very pleased and he's aspiring to have again the Nobel Peace Prize because he got the peace between Iran and Israel. But Gaza is still there. So as far as this is still there, I don't think we can talk about a global peace in the region.
Now, we heard in the last few minutes that the foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council will be meeting an emergency meeting here in Doha following the Iranian attack on the American base in Qatar, Al Udeid base. Iran opted to go after an American base in Qatar, a country which it has good relations with. They apparently had warned the Americans and the Qataris of their action prior to it happening. What are the implications of this for Iran's relations with Qatar, and what does this mean for the GCC as a whole?
Well, I mean, Iran chose this base because it's the biggest one, and because Qatar is the country that they enjoy the best relations within the GCC. So it would be less harmful attacking Qatar than any other base in the Emirates or Saudi or Kuwait. So I think that they negotiated something in a way to avoid further problems. I don't think any GCC states want to now to raise the tension with Iran. This was some trend that was working since 2022 when the Beijing Agreement was signed and when they normalized relations between Saudi, Emirates and Iran. And I assume that this meeting is more or less to keep that peace, to show the support to Qatar, to show Iran that this cannot happen again, this cannot be retaliation against GCC territory, it's unacceptable, but making sure that still that bases in the GCC will not be used to retaliate against Iran and to keep at least this cordial, not friendly relation between the GCC and Iran.
All right, Luciano, thank you very much for the moment. Luciano Sakara from Qatar University joining us here on Al Jazeera. And just to let you know that we are waiting for a news conference by the Qatari foreign minister this hour here in Doha, and we'll bring that to you live when it happens. It's coming up to almost 7:30 GMT, a reminder of our breaking news story on Al Jazeera. And the Israeli government says it's Gil Castro has more on how Trump's ceasefire announcement unfolded.
Even as air sirens sounded over Israel and Iran, U.S. President Donald Trump congratulated the two countries on social media, announcing it has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire. The timeline, as announced by Trump, said the ceasefire would begin 6 hours after his announcement posted at 22 GMT Monday. He said Iran would stop its attacks first, then Israel would follow, and upon the 24th hour, an official end to the 12-day war will be saluted by the world. He went on to congratulate both countries, Israel and Iran, on having the stamina, courage, and intelligence to end what should be called the 12-day war. This is a war that could have gone on for years and destroyed the entire Middle East, but it didn't and never will. The U.S. president ended the post by saying, "God bless Israel and God bless Iran," just a day after suggesting regime change in Tehran. Trump's whiplash announcement of a supposed ceasefire deal came hours after Iran fired missiles at the American Al Udeid air base in Qatar. No damage or injuries were reported. Qatar's prime minister reportedly helped secure Iran's agreement. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance gave Trump credit for taking the deal over the finish line.
Now, what that means, I think, is we have to talk to Iran and, of course, to Israel about what the future holds. Because while we have obliterated the Iranian nuclear program, our hope and our expectation is that they're not going to try to rebuild that program.
Meanwhile, Trump's claim that the war between Israel and Iran was coming to an end brought relief to some Republicans on Capitol Hill, as all wait to see if the ceasefire holds. Heidi Jo Castro.
Strategic Studies is joining us from Tehran. Thank you, Abbas, for being with us. So we have the Israelis saying that they've accepted the ceasefire announced by Donald Trump. No official confirmation from Iranian government officials as of yet. What is your sense of where they stand and where things are headed?
Fully, Iran is approaching the ceasefire very cautious. Lebanon and Palestine. So that's why Tehran is cautious whether this will be a fragile one or a lasting one, and there will be no violation. In case of violation, Iran will reserve right to respond. And the second is that the other party is the United States and American President Donald Trump, which has had enough of zigzag movements in the negotiations as well as recent developments. That's why Tehran is a bit cautious, and they have not been coming to verify this very officially, and they are waiting to see how things will proceed. And by the time that there is no violation, I think Iran will adhere to this ceasefire.
Okay. Iran, you say, will adhere to the ceasefire. This all began, Abbas, of course, with the premise that Israel wanted to end Iran's nuclear program. But at this stage, we don't know the extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear program or where it stands right now, right? So does that ambiguity allow basically everyone to take a step back and claim victory, allow for the Iranian government to claim victory?
Fully, in order to gauge victory, you have to look what the objectives of this aggression was. You know, you can look at this from different perspectives. Number one is that this was not just a war between Iran and Israel. It was a war between Iran versus Israel and the United States. And, you know, they were defining a goal, you know, in order to destroy Iran's nuclear program, then Iran's nuclear facility, as well as to bring a regime change by provoking people to help Israel against the government. But we have been seeing damages inflicted on Iran's nuclear facilities. But Iran's nuclear program, fully, is not just about those facilities and the equipment. They have been, you know, facing damages, but Iran has relocated the nuclear material to a secure place, and Iran's, let's say, know-how and the knowledge is intact, and you cannot bomb or destroy the knowledge. This is what Iran has been arguing. Israelis are claiming victory in terms of destroying Iran's missile power. The answer to this question is very simple. You look at what happened early this morning. Iran targeted places and Israeli targets this morning, you know, which had some casualties. So this was not the case as well. So there's a big question mark for that. They wanted also bring regime change. They had the calculation before the aggression that the Iranian people would come to streets helping Israel against the government. But what happened in practice was a unity and cohesion among Iranian public supporting the government against Israel and the United States. And there is a sense among the Iranian people that in order to tackle an external threat, they have to be solidifying the power inside the country. So they will support the government. The level of the support for the government in future will increase. So this is not the end fully. Iran looks at this a new beginning, and beginning of a new era, which will set the course in a different way, and that's a bigger picture we have to be paying attention to.
You say,
not just
Abbas
a couple
Asllani,
of weeks, not just tactical operations.
You say, Abbas Asllani, that this is not the end but the beginning of a new era. Does that mean then that the door is open for diplomacy going forward between Iran and the U.S., continuation of the nuclear talks, and perhaps even diplomacy with Israel? Is there appetite for that in Tehran?
The other parties think that they have been